an unprecedented effort by European leaders to sway US President Donald Trump on Ukraine. They're hoping to influence any deal with Russia's President Vladimir Putin. But what's the status of the Transatlantic alliance now? A relationship of equals, or is Trump fully in charge? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bays. Perhaps it's a sign of changed political times or of the urgent fears of European leaders about President Trump's next steps on Ukraine. But a delegation of Europe's most powerful leaders dropping everything to lobby directly the man in charge in the White House is truly unprecedented. They came armed with a fusillade of flattery just 2 days after Trump himself turned on the charm for Russia's President Vladimir Putin in Alaska. It would be hard to imagine Western leaders of days gone by in a similar setting. Margaret Thatcher, Jacques Chirac and Helmut Kohl, for example, sitting opposite George Bush in the White House in front of TV cameras or waiting while their host rang the Russian leader in Moscow. So what does this tell us about the balance of power in the Transatlantic alliance today? Are European leaders playing a shrewd game, tearing up conventional statecraft to woo and win over President Trump on Ukraine? Or is Trump simply the boss in the relationship? We'll discuss this with our guests shortly, but first this report from Victoria Gatenby.
European leaders in a show of unity in Washington D.C. to stress their support for Ukraine. For decades, NATO has worked by consensus, with Europe and the United States setting strategy together. But with Donald Trump in the White House, the relationship looks less clear, especially on Ukraine's future.
What that exactly will mean, the US involvement, will be discussed over the coming days. It is important to also know what the situation will be with the security guarantees to prevent Vladimir Putin from ever trying again to invade parts of Ukraine.
The EU and the UK have together committed tens of billions of dollars since the war began more than 3 years ago. But Donald Trump says US military and financial support still outweighs Europe's combined effort. He's called for European leaders to develop stronger defence capabilities and says US support for Ukraine is limited.
When it comes to security, they're willing to put people on the ground. We're willing to help them with things, especially probably if you talk about by air, because nobody has the kind of stuff we have. Really, they don't have.
The possibility of reduced American involvement in Ukraine has exposed differences within Europe. Poland and the Baltic states see Ukraine's survival as essential for their own security. Others, such as Hungary, remain reluctant to commit more money for weapons. Efforts are now underway to arrange a face-to-face meeting between the leaders of Russia and Ukraine.
We are not declining any formal work, either bilateral or trilateral. We'll progress step by step gradually, starting from the expert level and then going through all the necessary steps in order to prepare the summits.
Europe talks of partnership with the United States, but some fear the war in Ukraine may be highlighting an imbalance in the relationship between who leads and who follows. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's discuss all of this further with our guests today. In Montereau in France, Marc Storella is Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy at Boston University. He's also a former US ambassador and served as Deputy Chief of Mission at the US Embassy in Brussels. In Berlin, Jessica Berlin, non-resident senior fellow at the Centre for European Policy Analysis and founder of the strategy consultancy CoStruct. And in the Latvian capital, Riga, Eldar Mamedov, he's non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute and a former Latvian diplomat who served in embassies in Washington D.C. and in Madrid. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us today on Inside Story. Let me start with you, Jessica. Your reflection on those European leaders rushing to the White House on Monday to accompany President Zelenskyy. What does it tell us about how much power European leaders have to shape the future of Ukraine?
Well, this delegation wasn't so much a diplomatic mission with strategic goals and a list of outcomes that they were aiming to achieve. so much as a diplomatic bodyguard detail there to hopefully prevent the worst, i.e. another fallout between President Zelenskyy and President Trump, like we saw in February. The good news from this meeting, we did manage to somehow avoid the worst, which could have been, for example, President Trump in a rage, berating Zelenskyy once again before the cameras, or verbally making concessions to Russia that he's quite frankly not able to commit without Ukrainian approval. On the other hand, nothing concrete really resulted. The Europeans have a very limited ability to sway this president. He is notoriously erratic. Even just one day after that meeting in the White House, he was once again giving a rambling interview on Fox News, blaming Ukraine for Russia's aggression. So while they did manage to dodge a bullet, the European leaders were not really able to make progress on that visit, in my opinion.
Mark, those European leaders in the White House, what do you think their focus was? Were they really focused on how to end the war in Ukraine, or were they actually more focused on how to manage Trump? Was this about mood and ego management?
These are such interesting questions, and both sides of this are both important, I think. For Europeans, the war in Ukraine is a security issue on their doorstep. So they were there to tell President Trump, we have real security concerns here. This is something we care about, and you have to take our views into consideration. They also needed to bolster, as Jessica said, bolster Zelenskyy in his position, because frankly, he's the one who's going to be under the most pressure. Part of what I think is going on here that's really interesting is that the Europeans and the rest of the world are learning how to manage Trump. So there was an awful lot of thank you and flattery. I'm reminded of Henry Kissinger's line, if you think flattery doesn't work, you haven't had it tried on you. And obviously, Trump reacted very well to that. So they are also working on managing a person and managing the relationship, as well as securing their security interests.
Eldar, back in Alaska, and I was covering the talks in Alaska for Al Jazeera, President Putin, and they didn't take questions, either him or Trump, but he said, we expect that Kyiv and the European capitals won't throw a wrench in the works. Do you think that those European leaders actually want a deal, or do they want the current process to collapse without them getting the blame, with Putin getting Trump's ire?
I think European leaders want a ceasefire, and that was actually made very clear. Whereas the position of Russia is no ceasefire without a comprehensive peace deal. So, in a sense, what European leaders want to try to achieve, as I read it, is to achieve a ceasefire first without addressing what Russia sees its core demands, such as no NATO membership for Ukraine and territorial questions, and then provide security guarantees to Ukraine after the ceasefire, but without going to comprehensive political solution to that issue. And the fact that they all went to White House and found themselves in this somewhat unusual setting, the leaders of the most powerful European states in front of President Donald Trump, it also says about the fundamental failure of Europe to seek a diplomatic solution on its own. I mean, it's easy to blame Trump for trying to talk with Putin, but then for more than 3 years, European leaders did not try diplomacy at all. And the only one of them, Viktor Orban, Hungary's prime minister, who did try, he was marginalized and criticized in the EU councils.
Jessica, you heard Eldar say that they all want a ceasefire. That had been agreed beforehand. In fact, where you are, in the German capital, the Chancellor Merz and Zelenskyy met last week. They did a call of all the European leaders, and then they thought they'd got Trump on board with that position. And when he sits down with Putin, he completely forgets that part of it. I mean, that is the problem with dealing with Trump, is it not?
Precisely. Going into the meeting with Putin in Alaska, Trump was trumpeting that there would be severe consequences to pay for Russia if Putin didn't agree to a ceasefire during that meeting. And Putin predictably said no, and Trump predictably buckled. This is absolutely predictable. It should not have surprised anyone after 3.5 years of this war and now 10 years of observing Donald Trump in a leadership position one way or another. So no one in Europe should have been surprised. And the key issue here is that all the discussions of European and American security guarantees for Ukrainian security in the future are relying on a theoretical future ceasefire or peace agreement with Russia for the guns to stop. But that is not in Russia's interest. Russia has shown no intention, no desire, no willingness to budge on these issues. So all of the discussion of security agreements and guarantees are moot until we answer the question, what are Europe and the United States willing to do to stop Russia, to force them to put down the guns and stop the fighting?
Mark, you have a great deal of experience as a US diplomat watching big events take place. I want to come back to the tone, if I can. And we saw those leaders, all of them, fawning. Some would say it was obsequiousness by those leaders. Can you imagine leaders of the past? Can you imagine François Mitterrand, Helmut Kohl? Can you even just go back a couple of years? Let's look at this picture from 2018 of Chancellor Merkel at the G7 meeting. Can you imagine leaders from the past doing what these leaders did? And isn't it a little humiliating?
Well, in diplomacy, your focus is on interests. You will do whatever you need to do to advance the interests of your country. And I'm sure that's exactly what European leaders are doing. I'm reminded of 1986, when Ronald Reagan began to cut a deal with Mikhail Gorbachev, who actually understood him psychologically very well, that was going to be prejudicial to European security interests. Maggie Thatcher, then UK Prime Minister, jumped on a plane, went to Camp David, allegedly hit him over the head with her purse, but no doubt used a lot of charm to turn him around. I think that those leaders were very much thinking of how Margaret Thatcher was able to move an American leader in the past, and they were trying to do it themselves. I do want to underline, though, what Jessica said a bit. Putin is a master manipulator, and he seems to be able to manipulate Donald Trump easily. For our European allies, this is something that causes great alarm. And so, yes, we saw the mobilization of 8 senior leaders in Europe to come to Washington. That shows how important it was, but it also shows they understand they've got to make an impression. And so that's what they were doing. I wouldn't call it humiliation. I would call it effective use of diplomacy.
OK, Eldar, your take on that. A little embarrassing, the way they have to perform for Trump. Remember, this comes only a month ago with that EU trade deal with Trump, which was very favourable to the United States, with most EU goods with a tariff set at 15%.
Well, answering your first question first. Why would you not imagine previous European leaders such as Jacques Chirac or Helmut Kohl in that situation? The answer is because they, among other things, they had their own channels of communication with Moscow. And those channels were not frozen during the Cold War, during the time of unraveling of the Soviet Union, but they're frozen now. So you do find yourself in a humiliating situation when you cut your own channels of communication, and then you are left at the expense of President Trump, who is described as volatile, erratic, prone to charms from Putin and so on. But I don't agree with that line that Putin actually manipulated Trump. I think this is giving too much credit to Putin and also underestimating the calculations that are driving Trump. Because let's not forget, Trump is about America first. He has consistently emphasized that this is Joe Biden's war, not his war. He definitely does not want this to become his war, and he's perfectly fine with selling American weapons to Ukraine, with Europeans paying for that, but without getting involved directly. So I think it's more than about manipulation. It's just about the way Donald Trump sees his own and American interest in that.
Jessica, as we mentioned, last week European leaders thought they got Trump committed to a ceasefire before anything else happened. Now the new win apparently is security guarantees, but that's all very vague. What do you think Trump has signed up to there?
Before I answer your question, I'm just going to respond to the previous comments. To the contrary, Vladimir Putin is a seasoned KGB veteran. The Russian security services have a psych profile file on Trump decades thick. Okay, so let's be under no illusions. Vladimir Putin personally, and the Russian security apparatus as a whole, knows exactly how to manipulate Donald Trump. And it's not too complicated either with his personality profile, frankly. So let's be very clear. When Putin walks into a room with Donald Trump, he knows exactly what he needs to do and say to get the response he wants from Trump. And Trump has shown, whether in his interactions with Putin, with Xi, even with Kim Jong-un in his last term, that he is extremely susceptible to flattery, especially from powerful male authority figures like these dictators we're talking about.
Okay. Having said that then, Jessica, on the security guarantees, Trump apparently has been won over to this idea. When the European leaders were there in the White House, he wouldn't say whether that meant American troops. He's now already ruled out American troops taking part. What do you think Trump is offering here? Or is this something that also, like a ceasefire, will disappear down the line?
It is extremely important in any coverage of these kinds of back and forth discussions, back and forth reactions and statements from Donald Trump. Nothing he says is reliable. His one consistent trait is his inconsistency. And the fact that he says, I'm going to demand a ceasefire from Putin or else, and then a day later retracts it. The fact that he says the U.S. will commit to a security backstop in support of European security guarantees, and the next day insists that there will be no American troops. It just shows the merry-go-round is spinning round and round. Trump is not consistent. He does not have a cohesive strategy himself. He is a reactive character by nature, and he's in it for himself, for his own self-interest. So we cannot rely on these statements as holding water. And this actually brings us to the most important point and the most glaring failure of the past week. It's not about Trump. It's not about Putin. It's about Europe. And 3.5 years of failure by European leaders to actually develop a strategy for themselves, to communicate that strategy to European voters, and to commit to acting. We have not at this point here in Europe even managed to successfully implement the sanctions that we've already declared. We're not even on the economic front willing to use the leverage that we have and the leverage that we've committed. So this is ultimately what is giving Putin his leverage and what is giving Trump his power. The fact that the Europeans have developed a strategy of sort of performative helplessness. And now is the last of perhaps 37,000 wake-up calls over the past decade that Europe needs to decide, what are we willing to do to secure our continent? And that starts with Ukraine. And until we decide that, Trump and Putin will be determining the direction of this war.
Mark, let me ask you more about those security guarantees and what the US might offer, because confusing things further is Steve Witkoff, Ambassador Steve Witkoff, who just happens to be the envoy on this and on Gaza and on Iran, and I think several other things too. He said those security guarantees would be Article 5-like provisions, and he's referring to Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. That's the founding basic document of NATO of 1949, that one attack on any NATO state can count as an attack on all, and there currently are 32 NATO states. What do you think he means by Article 5-like provisions? Do you think that's going to scare Putin? Is it something that Putin would sign up to in a deal?
Well, first, what he means by Article 5-like is not Article 5. What he means is Ukraine is not going to be offered NATO membership. So it's going to be something less. And the question is, how much less will it be? What I'm seeing is an emphasis on European security guarantees with some kind of coordination by the United States. Obviously, that is much less than what Zelenskyy would like to see. Nevertheless, It's still under discussion and still under negotiation. There may be something there that's actually substantial. I think that Volodymyr Zelenskyy made an important comment when he said about security guarantees that they have to be somehow legally binding. There has to be a commitment that they can rely on. And the changeability of American policy does not reinforce confidence under these circumstances. I'd like to say about the Europeans, I think that in 1972, the United States said this will be the year of Europe. Well, here we are, 2025, and it's still not the year of Europe. Europe has had so much trouble bringing itself together, but they haven't done nothing. They're spending more on weapons. They have sanctions in place that are stronger than the American sanctions, albeit they're having trouble implementing them. We've seen the French and the UK come together to coordinate their nuclear arsenals. And I think as of today, the Europeans have provided more aid to Ukraine than the United States, and soon will surpass the United States in military aid as well as financial aid. So Europeans are trying to stand up, but it's very hard when you're dealing with 27 countries rather than one. So they're still having difficulty with that.
Eldar, some of the Europeans are talking about a reassurance force. France and the UK sort of say they're going to send troops, but nowhere near the front line. This is the so-called coalition of the willing, which is 30 or so nations. But is it fair to say some are much more willing than others?
Yes, even public statements from leaders of Italy, Germany, even Poland made it clear that these countries are not considering sending their forces to Ukraine under any circumstances. And I think it's meaningful that Russia has ruled out completely any presence of NATO forces in Ukraine. And that's definitely a deterrent to those leaders. But I think we should also ask a broader question. What the West has done so far, what more the West can do to support Ukraine than what it's done so far? With 18 sanctions packages adopted by the European Union, with weapon deliveries, it's hard to see what else the West can offer in terms of security guarantees that would stop short of declaring an open war on Russia. And this is the main question. It all boils down, all the talk about security guarantees, it all boils down to the question, whichever format that security force, peacekeeping force, whatever it is, takes, whether it's European or it's European-American, is it really willing to engage Russia militarily and consequently risk a military conflict direct military conflict with a nuclear-armed country? And I think that the events of the last 3.5 years have provided a definite answer to that, and the answer is no.
Jessica, let me bring you in on that. I mean, the idea of this reassurance force, given, as Eldar says, the Russians have said no way can there be NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine, is that a non-starter?
Well, I'll agree with Elgar on that point. The answer from Europe from the last 3 years has certainly been clear that they're not willing to send in ground troops. However, you raise an interesting point. You know, the fact that Russia says that wouldn't be okay is not really the issue. All right, because the rest of the world is saying it's not okay for Russia to send invasion forces into Ukrainian territory. Russia doesn't get to decide who comes to Ukraine's defense under the auspices of Article 51 of the UN Charter. All right. But even barring the ground troop limitation and the fact that European ground troops would also be much less effective fighters than Ukrainian ground troops, because our guys just don't understand this kind of war, frankly. There are concrete things that European allies can do. Number one, the Sky Shield proposal that has been accepted and circulated in a number of Western European capitals to provide air defense support over Western Ukraine to help defend Ukrainian cities and critical infrastructure against Russian missile and drone attacks, and sending Western European jets to support the defense of civil infrastructure and civilian cities far from the front lines, where there is absolutely zero chance of those pilots becoming engaged with Russian aircraft. That is one proposal that has been circulated that would be feasible, that would avoid a direct conflict between European and Russian forces. This would only be firing down Russian missiles and drones over Ukrainian sovereign territory. Number two, also on maritime patrolling in the Black Sea, this could be a great support to Ukraine, of course, who has limited naval capacity. Number three, also sending permanent observers, military observers and advisors from Western European and Eastern European NATO member countries to be permanently stationed in Ukraine, to be learning and integrating with Ukrainian forces, so that should the time come, should European forces, ground forces be needed in Ukraine, that will be that much better prepared and informed and able to support.
OK. Mark, going back to what Vladimir Putin said in Alaska on Friday, we need to eliminate all the primary roots, the primary causes of the conflict, to consider all legitimate concerns of Russia. How worried should European NATO members be about those words?
I think European NATO members are realistic about this. They know what they're dealing with. Sergei Lavrov, with whom I have worked in the past, the foreign minister of Russia, he doesn't do anything by mistake. Everything he does is intentional. He showed up at that meeting wearing a USSR sweatshirt. He's trying to say the Soviet Empire is back. And Soviet Empire, more than anything else, means dominion over Ukraine. We have to tell the world we won't accept it. And the only way to get there, the only way to convince the Russians, the only way to deal with their idea of their so-called root causes is through strength. So there are other things we can do. We should support Ukraine in all the ways that we just heard from Jessica. We should also consider the idea of seizing the assets that are held. It's about $300 billion, and using them to support Ukraine. And more than anything else, and this is probably the most fundamental thing, Vladimir Putin wants to divide the allies and divide the West. Despite all the difficulties, it is absolutely essential that we find ways to stick together.
OK, very quickly at the end, Mark, there's talk of a trilateral meeting, Trump, Putin and Zelenskyy. I want to ask each of you first, Mark, what do you think the percentage chance of that happening?
I think it can happen, but right now, Putin doesn't want to meet with Zelenskyy. He doesn't want to give him legitimacy.
Give me a percentage on it, Mark. Give me a percentage on it.
40%.
OK,
40%.
Jessica, is it going to happen? What
20.
percentage? OK, Eldar? What % chance that will happen?
Difficult to speak of percentages. I would say less than 50 at this point.
OK, thanks very much indeed. Thank you to all our guests, Mark Storella, Jessica Berlin and Eldar Mamedov. Stay tuned to Al Jazeera for continuing coverage of both the diplomacy and the events on the ground in Ukraine. And you'll find more context and analysis on our website, aljazeera.com. We'd like to hear from you too. Go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or get in touch using X. Find us at AJ Inside Story. That's it for now from me, James Bays. From all the team here in Doha, please stay safe and well. Bye-bye for now.
Don't miss out on the full picture. Subscribe to Al Jazeera for reliable news and expert insights. Like, share, stay ahead.